kick things off. Let's see if I feel like every time I stream, there's like one platform that just won't work. So I've kind of I don't know, create broadcast. Maybe let's see if that works. Okay, we're live on X. I think we're live on YouTube. Awesome. And we're live on LinkedIn. Okay, cool. We've done it. Not that it's necessarily my responsibility, but maybe to kick us off, if we can dive right into things. I feel like right now, when I'm looking at the chart on Bitcoin, we're obviously a bit higher than we were before, and now my big uncertainty is this a thing that's going to trap me? Like, is it that thing where you have a small bull run in an actual bear trend? Like it is crypto winter, but we get a bit of a relief rally. Or is it the thing that we're all kind of like, no, it's not a bear market. We're totally going back to all-time highs. We're actually going to go higher than previous all-time highs. And I know the 126K kind of feels a very distant point at this point in time. But obviously, if things move fast, they can move very fast, and people get liquidated on the way up as well. And so we could get there. Part of me, I think a bigger part of me expects that it's just a relief rally type of thing, where it's like maybe you go to 100K, even 110K, and then you kind of pull back. And then the real despair and capitulation starts because technically, chart wise, it just doesn't look good. And so I don't know, and I'm throwing it to the floor. Maybe Satiris, I know you're the technical analysis guru. Can we call you that, or the
That's a
astrologer?
very strong word. Yeah, more of an astrologist.
We'll take that. Whatever works. But so, how do you feel about that?
So I'm personally feeling a bit of a shift in sentiment. Um, so probably dangerous if I'm starting to feel a bit bullish again. It probably means local top is in. But I do feel there has been sort of a shift in sentiment across the board, specifically with crypto, where I think on our last call, um, it was feeling pretty desperate. I think we've just had sort of 5 6 weeks of Bitcoin just sort of bouncing around the sort of 80 to 90 range, um, mostly below like mid 80s, if anything. Um, and the inflows for the ETFs were like negative a lot of the time. A lot of altcoins were just getting decimated, especially meme coins, for example. They looked pretty dead. And what we're seeing now on this sort of relief bounce, shift in price action, I'm not sure what to refer to it just yet, but you're seeing sort of ETF inflows pick back up. Um, what I thought was quite telling is the sort of meme coin relative strength that I think is a good
Mm,
indicator of sort of like risk, speculation,
yeah.
a bit more retail participation as well. So you're seeing quite nice sort of bounces across the board on meme coins as well there, which might start to indicate a bit of a shift in structure and a bit of shift in appetite. And maybe it's just seasonal. It's people tax loss for the last year, rest off, or on holiday. Now we're sort of early Jan, and people are wanting to sort of dip their toe back in the water, get a bit more risk on. So yeah, I think it's felt like quite an interesting shift, and from a TA perspective as well. Maybe I can just share my screen quickly. If we go to Thomas, you can kind of see here like the slow stochastic has pretty much been flat, so we're starting to see maybe a slight uptick here. This on the weekly time frame. The MACD is kind of looking like it's sort of bottoming. The RSI has been sort of a series of lower highs on the weekly since
Yeah.
what was that, March 2024. So I think for me, seeing what the RSI does is like one of the things I tend to put a bit more weight on. So I think if we can start to see sort of price creeping back up, the RSI may be starting to make a few higher highs, then we could be in a good spot.
100%. The one maybe caveat I would say on the RSI is I feel like a lot of people look at the direction of the indicator as like a proxy for where price should go. And from my experience, at least, it's more relevant either to look at divergences, which we're alluding to before, where it's like you have the higher highs and the lower lows on the RSI, or when it gets to extreme levels. So that's why when you load up an RSI on any type of trading terminal, you always have those bands, right? It's either at 70 and 30 or 80 and 20. And when they get out of those bands, that's when the direction and the reversals actually make more sense. Now, of course, it's always like just one factor across a broader analysis. And you talked about the MACD and you've got the stochastics. And if everything's pointing in one direction, chances are that it is pointing in that direction. But always take it with a bit of a grain of salt. That being said, the investor in me is like 100% rooting for you, to be right and for the indicator to show that.
And one thing just on that point regarding the RSI, if you look at where we kind of have maybe made a local bottom on the RSI at least, it was down to about 34, which is actually this whole sort of period of consolidation back in the sort of mid 22 to the start of January 23, basically, which is what kicked off the latest bull run. So as far as sort of relative strength and sentiment, the last few months has felt not that far off kind of how rough things were feeling at the bottom of the last bear market. So not sure if like the bottom's in and now it's like a new bull cycle or anything like that, but just kind of interesting to see the sentiment. So would love to hear Thomas as well. Any take on your side?
And just to echo what you were saying, I think it just goes back. I feel like you and I are both saying kind of the same thing, as in like there's this uncertainty, like limbo stage, where it's like it could be something and it could also not be something. So I don't know. Yeah, Thomas, how do you feel about it?
Yes, the frustrating answer is that we're not. It's too early to tell. Unfortunately, I think the loss harvesting. I think that's something I think I messaged you guys as well. That I was heavily expecting. It's something that's very, very common. Any sort of stock that has been punished quite a bit gets typically punished a lot more towards any sort of year end. That's just investors trying to make essentially turn their losses into a bit of utility. They can ultimately reduce them based on the inverse of the tax rate, 1 month's the tax rate. And that, unfortunately, Bitcoin wasn't at that bracket. It was down 6%. And from that perspective, taking into account, especially if you take assets that would be somewhat in a diversified portfolio in a similar spot, take gold, you could take precious metals. I think in general, they would have done fairly well. So, they would have reduced exposure there, locked in the capital gain, and therefore, that would have been a nice way to offset the losses, especially if we take into account that we're looking at, this is a debasement trade, right? What we're seeing with gold, what we're seeing with silver, and it's a very, 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 very strong debasement trade. So what that means is an inflationary thing. Ultimately, we're looking at investors diversifying into gold as hard money in order to essentially hedge inflation risk, and that's typically seen in areas where there's a lot of uncertainty about monetary policy, which we've obviously seen, right? Because there's a lot of I think concerns about the US government getting involved into monetary policy, which is what they're not meant to be doing. At least based on, this is we can argue on this, but generally, they're obviously not meant to be there. And if we're taking this into account, and if we look at Bitcoin at something similar, which you can make these correlations over longer term horizons, then it's certainly something where you can say, right, this is an asset that is somewhat correlated, and directionally at least, there is a bit of catching up to do, and therefore a bit of a convergence trade to be done, which is just sell gold essentially cut down your exposure in order to add exposure to an asset that you would deem to be doing well in a similar macroeconomic environment. And I think that would be the follow through if we were to see it. If I look at this chart, I'm looking at a nice run up followed by, and this is very typical in a bull run, followed by a bit of a reduction. I went from 126 back to 90. Previously, I think we went to like 110. Went back to the high 70s, and one could make the case that we're still in this sort of paradigm, that we're still in a regime where debasement assets will be doing quite well. And from that perspective, generally, I can't see, and this is something that I'm also hearing from a lot of partners that I'm talking to in the industry, I don't see how Bitcoin can't be higher in 2 years. There's obviously a lot of cases to be made for that, so I'll have to caveat it. But ultimately, yeah, I would still think we'll have to see what's happening, but I would be surprised if we wouldn't be picking up where we would have left off. The economy's in a very, very strong space. There's NVIDIA just upped their forecast. So it also seems like the AI narrative that, which again is, I think, a big regime, much similar to the internet in the early 2000s, which is now picking up again. It's going to fuel an additional value, and that ultimately is going to probably get investors to be risk on. And risk on, I think, for an asset, again, in a debasement environment that should be doing very well, I don't see how it shouldn't. But we'll see.
And question for you, Thomas, like, do you have a view as to why gold is outperforming and Bitcoin performing, well, less? As in, do you think it's because of infrastructure and rails, for investments and holdings of the assets, as in, like, governments and pension funds, buying actual gold, or central banks, increasing their reserves because geopolitical issues and the debasement you're talking about? Or is it because Bitcoin had too much of a run up and so people took profit, or because technically it looked like the right thing to do? Is it because it's a more liquid, like gold is a more liquid and more established market? Like, how do you think about that? And I totally understood what you said, about like maybe this is a time where you do sell gold and buy Bitcoin because you expect some kind of convergence or outperformance from the underdog. But like, why do you think that has happened in the past 6 months where gold is just flying higher?
Right, so I think on gold, there's the main buyers of gold are central banks, and have been central banks, and that's ultimately where any government at this point, in times of a high degree of uncertainty, which is what we're currently looking at. I mean, we've not even touched on Venezuela, but we don't have to if we just look at that chart. And so in these sort of macroeconomic timeframes, what tends to happen is gold accumulation, and we've seen that over central banks, and that's been the predominant driver. Obviously, as central banks accumulate gold, you obviously push the market because you need to buy a significant amount of gold, and that rally is then going to go through essentially all of the professional all the way up to the retail trading regimes, traders ultimately, and that just makes that rally all the more explosive. And that's what we've seen. So driven by central banks, to answer your question, which fueled essentially a lot of retail trading. And it's a very, very overcrowded trade, to a point where gold is a very, very large asset. It's very, very difficult to move. So to move it, you need to be buying not just a metric ton or two, but a few more. And so from that perspective, it's moved into other precious metals. So this is almost like I wouldn't necessarily call it a bubble, but it's within an emotional trading regime. It's what you're seeing. Well, there's one precious metal that's doing very well, which is largely capitalized, and then that rally moved into an asset that's slightly less capitalized. Is generally a lot dependent on industrial cycles, and that's been silver. And silver is a really, really interesting meme coin at the moment for a lot of people. And because it's capitalized, we're seeing meme coin-like features. And so on silver, that's a bit of a different story. But yeah, to me, it's just a matter of time until that circles back into crypto. It's just having that initial driver that would push Bitcoin back over 100K, after which I think we would probably be seeing a very, very constructive market. I think 100K is a level that I would love to see break, and then I would have more conviction in a even short-term bullish view.
I think it's also super interesting to see that Bitcoin is really not parabolic. So when you look at the chart, it very much looks like just an uptrend that's very linear instead of being curved, you know, like gold that we were looking before. So you could really draw maybe this way, like a trend that goes, and it doesn't have to curve at all to follow the price action. Whereas when we're looking at gold, you definitely see that convexity. And so but the thing is now it almost makes me question whether, you know, Bitcoin will get that. And I think one of the narratives that I've been hearing when I'm talking with clients, and let's say the past weeks, is a lot of people are talking about alts again. And I don't know if it's just people coping and hoping that, you know, alts would actually kind of come out of the woodwork and play a massive role. But I'm almost wondering if we're kind of not done with Bitcoin in the markets, and then we see how things go for the altcoins, basically. So I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I think in general the trend line is, that's just to sort of, you know, respond to it. That is, or you can call it a channel, and it's been obviously, I mean, it would tell a very nice storyline. I think the one thing that we're probably omitting is how differently Bitcoin trades since the beginning of 2024, because it's no longer, it's very much equity based, and there's a lot more volume, which previously would have come from, you know, the likes that would have gotten Bitcoin exposure through adjacent instruments like, you know, Coinbase, mainly some miners, whereas now we're just completely, Bitcoin at the moment trades like an equity. And so from that, like equities very much. And yeah, we just need an initial push. So I would argue that whilst you could be correct, there would be a bit of a paradigm shift. And therefore I wouldn't necessarily look at this trend line as something that would be significant. But then you've got another trend line that I like a lot more. So maybe let's talk about that trend line instead.
But let's talk about your trend line. But so Thierry, the one thing I would point is on the trend line is the way I would have drawn it, we would have broken down the lower bound, basically. So you see, like, yeah, exactly. I would have lined it up with those lows. And that's the thing that scares me with this.
I was trying to make it a bit better. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it. I'm just like, let's please everybody look at Thierry's version. The point is, like, mine is the thing that does worry me is you have this kind of long linear setup of a bull market. And then you've got this almost like not stagnation, but we're looking at the chart on a weekly basis. So that's kind of a lot of time to spend under that lower line. And again, that's why I'm thinking if we do get a relief rally, how far does it take us? And if it takes us even at the all-time high, is it still due for a lower low afterwards? Is the whole economy, you know, a bubble because equities, AI, gold, everything's gone too high, too fast? And yeah, I really don't know. Maybe something I think we should talking about risk assets is what I feel like everybody's talking about Venezuela, and I feel like we have to talk about it as well because I'm so curious to hear your thoughts. First, I don't know. What do you guys think? I feel like for our generation, like people our age, it's kind of the first time that we've seen this, basically. Not to say that there aren't more shocking events, but the idea that you wake up one morning and the White House is bragging that they went to Venezuela and kidnapped the president and his wife and brought them back to the US with an elite military operation. To me, it's just so mind-blowing, basically. And I don't even think that it's so impactful macroeconomics-wise, but I just think like the symbolism, the symbolic, or the I don't know, the idea that I have now of what the world could be just changes dramatically. And of course, there's the oil thing. And of course, there's the Bitcoin reserves that Venezuela was holding after seizures of blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. What are your guys' take on it. Sotiris, you're unmuted, but I know that you might not be allowed to say everything you think in your household. But
no, obviously it's.
Sotiris, do you want to take up the stream, by the way, just while we talk about the non?
Yeah, no, obviously it's quite a shock, quite a paradigm shift to have sort of the US implementing such a blatant sort of regime change in what they class as their sort of sphere of influence. So South America's are sort of a geographic neighbor to the US. And so I think that sets a precedent for other countries potentially to be like, well, if the US can do it, does Russia invading Ukraine seem that different anymore? What about China trying to sort of expand their influence across the South China Sea? So maybe they could be considering a regime change in the Philippines, for example. And it'll be hard for the US to sort of play the moral high ground anymore when it comes to sort of some supposedly unbreakable like global rules or global laws that most nation states sort of try to abide to. So obviously you've got things like not firing nuclear weapons, for example, and outside of the sort of Cold War era, the US hadn't really been sort of trying to do any sort of local regime changes in their neighborhood. Obviously they had sort of a lot of influence in the Middle East with Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, Lebanon, all of that. But I think the fact that it is so close to home for them, and they say because of that, it's a sort of strategic threat to the US. I think that enables a lot of other countries to sort of use a similar argument if they wanted to expand their influence. And then ultimately, I think there's not much sort of hiding the fact that the US just wants to kind of get Venezuelan oil, have some stability there. I think it also helps sort of lessen dependency on oil from, say, Russia and Iran as well, which again plays to the US's favor if those countries are having sort of diminished revenue from oil sales there as well. And then I think finally it potentially is a bit of a pushback as well to this sort of BRICS allegiance you're seeing with like China with Xi, Modi, Putin. They're all starting to get very friendly. And I know Russia and China obviously had quite a lot of stakes in Venezuela when it came to sort of oil extraction and production. And so I think it's also a bit of signaling from the US to China and Russia, and probably by extension India as well. Just a reminder of who the big boss is still, at least at this stage, which is the US. Personally, I don't think it's a good thing invading, but at the same time, it's a very complex web of geopolitical pros and cons, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting situation because you could totally argue both sides and be totally right, depending on how you choose to view the situation and which facts you choose to focus on. A quick note before, Thomas, you give us your view, but I was listening to a Bloomberg interview of like an international law guy, and he was addressing what you were talking about, because like the interviewer was asking, well, if he can do that, can other nations then attack their neighbor and claim blah, 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 and so on? And he was actually, like, surprisingly pointing out that in international law, you actually do have the right to take action when there's a threat, for example, of like narco trafficking against your country. So you can see that as like a national risk and then attack, the foreign country on that basis. And so he was also pointing out to an interesting fact, which is the Maduro. Apparently there was a warrant for his arrest for the longest time. Like even with the Biden administration, they had like a 25 million or 50 million US dollar bounty for Maduro. And so it's interesting because I think there are a lot of people that are more on the Biden side than the Trump side are like, really shocked at the Trump action, but it almost feels like he was just successful at following through an action that was put in place, or at least that was supported, by the Biden administration. And so, of course, I think all of us on this call are cynical enough to think that it's mostly about the oil and not so much, about Venezuela, manufacturing or distributing drugs. But there is a real case for the fact that the guy was, in a real sense, a dictator and using drugs, to fund some things. And also the fact that there were a lot of Venezuelan immigrants going to the US because of the terrible conditions that exist in Venezuela, right? So that's my point about like being able to see it in both ways, because I can totally see that as a deliberate act from a foreign nation to just seize government and be like, oh, Exxon, Chevron, guys, come and get it because the oil is free now. And on the other hand, I think there's like a real thing in Venezuela, and probably they'll be somewhat better off by having that guy being removed, whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing and in the proper way and so on. But if you look at the bond market relative to Venezuelan economy, it's actually up, as in like people are more bullish on the Venezuelan economy, which doesn't necessarily mean that the conditions of living are better, but it's like a really interesting indicator. So I just wanted to put it out there that that's a thing about the law, like the international law, where there's a case to be made, which I don't think Putin could have made about Zelensky. You can talk about maybe corruption and the rumors about Nazi and so on, but it wasn't like a threat to Russia, I think. Same with Taiwan and China.
Pushing to join NATO could be viewed as a threat towards Russia, sort of.
Yeah, no, totally. I'm sure. I'm sure there's like a lot of ways to massage it, but I think there was a bit of
I get your point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't think China can say that the prime minister of Taiwan or the president of Taiwan is like a narco trafficker or threatening, blah blah blah. But then of course you can always use things. So anyway, that's just the thing I wanted to put out there. Thomas, you're on mute, but tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I would agree that it is a very, very complex issue that I'm also not trying to value by any means, because it's done, so it doesn't really matter. I think similar to ultimately Bitcoin, I'll keep an eye out on the follow through, right? So I would be very, very interested as to what is going on in the Middle East now. So if there's any, and it won't be 1 month or 2 months, but it could be a few months down the line, if we're seeing the US military presence thinning further in that region, that will be somewhat of an indication. But these are obviously also multi-year projects, like we've seen with Afghanistan, right? And so from that perspective, we would sort of see what that would mean in terms of natural resources. One could even make the point that now, assuming that you could run you would be able to improve the access to oil, therefore increase supply. Obviously, initially we've seen this sort of rally where Chevron, just due to their assets on the ground in South America, outperformed peers, and now we've seen that trade come back a little bit, basically due to supply fears, right? And that's the other thing, so this could be 5D chess, which it probably is, and it's obviously impossible for us with the information that we have available, the vetted information publicly available, right? Objective information specifically. It's really, really hard to sort of understand what we're looking at, but one could make the case that it could sustain an economy for longer, because the key driver that generally stops an economy from running hot is if the oil price, as for statisticians, increases by 100% over 12-month period. That's actually been one indicator that's been very, very reliable, because this means that things are extremely overheated. Now you increase supply, you drag that out for a bit. Generally, fossil fuels are a big, big part of the economy. Keeping that low is going to help the US economy, but it is also going to weaken Russia, because if it does, in fact, increase supply, it would, by default, also decrease price, which means that Russia at this point would have less revenue at their disposal. And I think that's one thing that I would want to watch. And so that's going to be a really, really interesting thing. But again, these are multi-year projects, like to build a pipeline. There's a great use case to actually deploy Bitcoin miners and sort of increase capital efficiency through that, but generally takes years to build it because it's nothing that a ChatGPT prompt could generally solve. So yeah, it's a very, very complex issue. 5D, 6D chess probably, and we'll see how it pans out. Not valuing this by any means, but I think in the short and medium term, it's a positive thing. Markets have reacted very, very constructively. So I think in terms of this being a driver or negative catalyst for a risk-off, regime that could push Bitcoin into proper bear and therefore outs into proper bear market territory, Bitcoin probably more so than outs because outs are already there. But yeah, so we'll see. But yeah, it's all about the follow through at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were saying about the fact that anything takes many years, like in terms of the oil production and so on. So any impact that people are speculating on right now is like, oh, it's going to crash the price of blah, blah, blah. It's like, I think Venezuela isn't producing that much. I know they have like massive oil reserves, but I don't think they produce that much or sell that much compared to other countries. So I don't know if, like, say tomorrow the US wants to open the tap. I don't know if they can do much, in the next 6 months or 12 months anyway, right? So anyway.
So their production has actually increased right over the last 15 years. So it's definitely not insignificant. And I think so from that perspective, could they in the short term influence the supply to a degree where markets could respond? I think that's absolutely possible because we also know that if things need to happen, they can happen quite quickly. And, in the worst case, looking at it, markets also price things at 6 months in advance on average, between 6 and 12 months. So that's one thing we need to take into account. But in the short term, it could weaken Russia. And maybe that's the 4D chess that we're looking at. But yeah, absolutely fair point. It will take a lot of time, but markets discount, right?
For comparison, Venezuela is doing roughly 1 million barrels per day output. Comparing that to like Russia, which is around 9 million, as well as Saudi Arabia around 9 million. So it's like fairly large difference there. Apparently, though, Venezuela in its heyday before the oil got nationalized was doing about 3 billion barrels a day output. So there's been about a 66% reduction due to sanctions, due to a lot of the oil sort of equipment and refineries not having the upkeep they've required. And so I think there could be, like you said, it's going to take a good few years for production to really ramp up in any meaningful way. But I think over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, assuming the US has a lot of like US oil companies in there investing the money, I could imagine they could get oil production up to nearly like Saudi Arabia or Russian sort of levels, especially given the sort of advancements in technology. When 20 years ago they were doing 3 million barrels a day, now I imagine they could be getting more than that, and then that really starts to sort of eat away at Russia's lunch, especially if sort of sanctions remain on Russia, and then they're going to want to sort of not piss the US off as much. So then they'll probably stop buying as much Russia from oil if there's sort of other alternatives. And maybe this is also part of a negotiation tactic with Putin to try and find a resolve in Ukraine fairly quickly, so sanctions can also be lifted there. But then ultimately, I think it just gives the US a bit more stability as well on where they'll be getting their oil from in the coming decade. And I know we talked about energy a lot, but I think that's going to be the biggest driver for sort of economic growth over the next sort of 5-10 years, as we get sort of increasing computational demands with AI, and obviously it's not solely going to be coming from oil, but oil is one sort of contributor to sort of energy dependence, especially during a more transitional phase.
I hate to be that guy, but I think it's also like such a good like textbook illustration of the impact of like deep socialism versus capitalism in a country where, you know, you talk about the oil production before, you know, nationalizing XYZ resource. And then you just see an obvious decline in productivity and GDP per capita, you know, in the country. And then even without really thinking about it, as we talk about the next, you know, the regime change and the impact it's going to have on industries, businesses, manufacturing, distribution, international geopolitics, blah, 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 it immediately takes a little bit more of a positive term, despite what you think of it from a value, moral, you know, perspective, but just from a pure business and productivity, immediately we start to think, well, yeah, of course, if this changes, then it can ramp up production. Why can it ramp up production now versus not in the past 10 or 20 years? Well, you know, it kind of speaks for itself. So anyway, just a small parenthesis to push my capitalistic agenda. Go ahead, Sudhir.
I know on that as well. I think it'd be an interesting sort of live case study to see play out where if this regime change does sort of diminish sort of a more socialist government and you have more of a capitalist sort of shift in Venezuela and you have sort of the spigot turned back on with sort of removal of US sanctions as well, just to kind of see what could then be possible with a more capitalistic approach across the country. Because I think it's quite clear that the quality of life for the vast bulk of Venezuelans has been sort of incredibly difficult, and it's not been a sort of shining example of socialism.
And it's the people who were vouching for, you know, advocating for Venezuelan immigrant to come to the US, which I think is not a bad thing, but the same people that were saying, oh, the immigrants have to be let in because the quality of life is so bad in Venezuela, are now kind of disputing the fact that the guy heading the country was bad. And I'm just like, you can't have it both ways. Like either you have a bad government and you have terrible conditions of living that require people to move to another country, or it is good and then it doesn't, but you can't have both, right? And so I think ultimately for the country it will be a positive thing. Whether that's the intention, you know, that the US has, I don't think so at all. I think it's a
I don't think Trump gives a shit about the quality of life of Venezuelans. It's just a convenient sort of selling point. But if it is a byproduct though of, say, more of a capitalist sort of influence, and again, this could just be like a modern example of where capitalism can sort of play out well.
I think speaking of modern examples as well, there's actually far too few, unfortunately, unless we're looking back. You know, I guess Poland's one of the better examples, right? If you will, Spain as well, right? So Franco disappearing, but generally, if we're looking at, you know, countries like Egypt, Libya, you can also make the other case. I think there's a few things that play a role, and it's ultimately, you know, how it's based on the institutions, right? It's based on how strong of legal system they have, which is the basis for conducting business, and having that sort of structure in place, having a peaceful transition, because a lot of these, like Libya, they you know, end up being caught up in a power struggle, and power struggles remain for a long time, and that doesn't necessarily help. And, you know, there can be arguments also made both case, but yeah, hopefully we'll keep our fingers crossed. It was a positive liberation. There's been a lot of liberation.
Pretty much every country in the US has done a regime change and liberated. It's not gone well for the country or the people, but maybe this time is different.
I think there's that meme where you see, like, you know, any country with like big oil reserve, it's like you need some freedom, you know, type of thing.
Yeah.
It's totally that. Maybe kind of a weird question, but I think now it kind of makes sense after what happened in Venezuela. But do you think that the US could almost kind of just seize Greenland, basically, and say, you know, F you to Denmark? I think that's Denmark, right? Or Finland. But like Denmark, right? And I just feel like it wasn't unthinkable 2 weeks ago. And now if you told me the US has set up a base in Greenland and what the hell is Denmark going to do about it? I don't think it's crazy anymore. I think it's very unlikely, but I'm just kind of thinking out loud here.
Yeah, I feel with Greenland, it's probably not going to be a sort of militaristic operation because, firstly, there's no real leader to take out in Greenland, for example. And so I think for them having a more sort of like soft power approach, I think is a more likely example. And so I remember when they first started talking about like the US sort of like subsuming Greenland, they were going to offer American citizenship to all citizens of Greenland, treat it kind of like a sort of 51st state almost, or a little bit like Puerto Rico, where you have sort of US nationalism, but then it's still sort of self-governed and a sovereign sort of sister nation, but very much under the US's control and purview. And so I think for people living in Greenland, it's a pretty good sell. It's like you get US citizenship, you won't get taxed by the US system, but you get sort of the protection and the I guess the global power the US brings. And if the US are involved, then I imagine there would be a non-insignificant amount of sort of like militaristic infrastructure build out and development, which would have some trickle over to sort of the like capital like towns and cities of Greenland. I know it's a very sort of sparsely populated country or nation, but yeah, I'm not sure how negotiations are going to go though, because ultimately if Denmark doesn't want to give it up, I'm not sure how that's going to work. And the US going to be like, well, Greenland, fight for sovereignty first, and then once you leave Denmark's power, then the US will welcome you with open arms. It's kind of wild that Denmark still has a claim on such a large piece of land as a relatively like
small country,
small and fairly insignificant country on the global stage. And I can see a lot of arguments for the sort of strategic significance of Greenland being under the control of the US, especially when it comes to the sort of like the resources in the Northern Hemisphere, especially around the poles. I know there's sort of a lot of competing factors when it comes to obviously the Antarctic as well, but on the Arctic, you've got things like oil reserves and people trying to lay claim to that. But more importantly, you've got Russia and China, who are sort of also vying for power and influence there. You've got Canada blocking most of the US's kind of access there initially. And so having Greenland, it kind of gives them not just a really like strong militaristic launching point kind of
that's it
to Europe and Russia, it also gives them much larger access to the Arctic as well.
Yeah, agreed. I think the last point is the thing that I've seen quite often online, which is just from like if you look at the globe instead of a map, you realize how close the top of Russia and the top of, let's say, Canada, to make it simple, is. And so where Greenland sits from just like how close, if you need to send missiles or stop something coming in and so on. So yeah, very interesting. Thomas, I don't know if you have, I mean, I don't think it's a very relevant subject to crypto, of course, but do you have any view on that?
I think the interesting, just sort of, a couple of things, some of which I can share, others I can't. But I think if we're looking at this soft approach, Sotiris, that you mentioned, which I think we're looking at rather, so Russia didn't announce, oh, we'll invade Ukraine. The US didn't publicly announce, right, Trump did obviously say that they were going to do a lot of things to Venezuela, but they've never quite announced that with purpose, and to a degree where it would have been taken serious enough or would have been priced as something highly probable. And the difference here is that they're saying something that I believe likely isn't going to happen, but it's the US actually already has a great degree of military presence in Greenland. So that's actually something that's been completely ignored. And I think Denmark has been really, really liberal with regard to that. I mean, obviously the US still have a lot of military presence in Europe as well. And then the other follow-up question is, could this be related to natural resources, where the easy answer is it easier to, extract it from Venezuela, or would it be easier to extract? Because I think in terms of the layouts, the minerals, the rare earths, there's not as much oil in Greenland, obviously, than there is in Venezuela, but it's logistically a lot harder because of that ice challenge to extract it from Greenland, because it would be a lot. Otherwise, everybody would be fighting over Antarctica right now, right? But it's a real challenge to do so. And so from that perspective, it's a sign of strength. It's something that we've been used to quite a bit over the past year. And it will continue. But I don't think markets haven't reacted, and that's a sign for me that there's not a high conviction in markets that is actually something that they would deem to be, likely. And that would be the follow up there. But yeah, and I think you were just looking at Polymarket as well. We've kind of seen how it went up, but then over the past couple of days, people believe it's less likely for them to do it, because also you would need, with Venezuela, that this nice, maybe it was an excuse, maybe it wasn't, there's the drug trafficking, which is like a nice thing, as you mentioned as well. But according to international law, that can be, a case can be made. Obviously, through law, a lot of cases can be made, but it would be very difficult to argue that Greenland would have been predatory in any sort of way. Just good memes, I guess, that we're getting from it.
Yeah, the memes are always the best part.
What do you think about it, Justin?
I think your analysis, Sotiris, about, like maybe a soft type of approach rather than a military one, making more sense. I think you're totally on point. But the thing that I think that's interesting with this conversation is you can see the US, and then you can see neighbors down, and you can see neighbors up, and you can see how, I don't know, Trump has this much more strong arm or strong hand, on territories around him. And he's got a very pragmatic approach about how he wants to ensure, that the US retain power. And so I just think that the Greenland part of the equation is like interesting to think about, although probably, not much happens, and it's just a gradual process, and then maybe using that as a base. So yeah, 100%. Guys, I'm thinking about the time. I can go a bit over, but I don't know if you guys can. Something that I really wanted to talk about is not my lighter.
I was gonna say your lighter.
Not my lighter. No. I'll do my shilling at the very end of the call, as I always do. No, but like any major thoughts for 2026? Maybe I think that's kind of a nice way to close it off. Even though, of course, we can go over if it goes too long, but. Thomas, for example, like if you think about the next 12 months, so I know that 12 months in crypto feels like a really long-term view and not a short or medium-term view. Any wild guesses, theses, like Doge up to that level, or the US does this, or a national reserve, blah, 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 or alts this. How do you think about the market?
Yeah, I think the easiest, so I'll make two predictions. I think that and I think especially in the beginning of the year, it's kind of good to look at that 12-month horizon. I think that we will see new all-time highs this year in Bitcoin. And I think that in relative terms, Ethereum is going to outperform. And any sort of other blockchains that essentially can leverage the ZK technology, which has essentially solved the trilemma. So I think we're finally at a place where we can really solve problems on scale. We can process a lot of transactions on scale, and that is going to be priced in eventually, because Ethereum is going to be used either directly or indirectly quite a bit. And so yeah, two predictions: Bitcoin higher. I want to say 150, and I'll put out 150. So do take it. And for Ethereum, I'm going to say I'll be a bit more conservative, and I'll call it 8K. And then I think we'll be a happy new year. In fact.
Yeah. Soterios? I know it's a broad question, right? But is it, or even if it's not necessarily a prediction, is there like maybe a wish list item, of like something that you would like to see, or something that you think is going to take us by surprise, or that people are not paying attention to?
I think stablecoin adoption will be something very telling, as opposed to sort of actual real world adoption. And so there's been a lot of input put around sort of the Genius Act and stablecoin adoption. And so I think seeing the sort of integration and proliferation of blockchain through the use of stablecoins across a lot of sort of more traditional businesses and traditional sort of institutions, I think will be quite telling. How that reflects in the price of like crypto and altcoins specifically, though, I'm not too sure about at this stage. I could imagine a scenario where Bitcoin basically chops down further, forms a bottom around October of this year, and then we just sort of have a similar 4-year cycle pattern play out again, where it starts to make a recovery from there at the bottom of the year. But then at the same time, I could also see Bitcoin doing what no one expects, which is probably more Thomas's approach, where everyone was thinking, oh, it's either going to play out like the 4-year cycle, and we have the peak in October of last year, which we kind of did to the day. And then we just chop down to the October bottom of the following year. It does all feel a bit too perfect and a bit too obvious. And so I could imagine something like Thomas's 150K come June or something, where we get a last leg to this rally, maybe going into the midterms. Everything gets a bit frothy and a bit silly, especially as Trump tries to sort of curry as much favor going into the midterms as possible. And we could just see like a really bullish sort of shift across the board. I do think, though, the biggest sort of like detriment to crypto at the moment is AI, robotics, where a lot of speculative resale capital is probably going to be drawn to things like AI and robotics, where you have slightly more tangible use cases, and I think a more sort of like grokkable and arguably valid argument for what's going to be the bigger disrupting future technology, where I think crypto previous cycles, you could sort of paint this very idealistic picture of, oh, this is revolutionary technology, it's going to change the world, and you're betting on the future now, so invest. Where crypto now is sort of mature enough, people are starting to realize, oh, a lot of these sort of dreams and promises aren't maybe materializing as we expected. And a lot of the blockchain implementation has been a bit underwhelming, whereas a lot of AI and robotics is still very blue sky. And so you're going to get a lot of wild speculation around, oh, AI is going to change everything, robotics is going to change everything, and people are just going to want to take a punt on that, which probably means less capital going into crypto, unfortunately. So not super bullish personally for this year, but if I'm saying that, then it's probably going to be a good year for crypto.
More than crypto.
Exactly. I am thinking about upping my allocation, though.
I do agree with you, and I hate that I agree with you, but I do think the whole AI robotic narrative, which is such a transformative technology, and it's kind of like undeniable. So it's not about belief, it's not about faith, about what the future might hold. The way we've invested in crypto, whereas like, oh, VeChain is going to be the verification layer for logistics, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, and then it turns out to not be, or maybe it could have, right? But it was based on faith. Whereas I think LLMs, AI, robotics, all of that applied into the real world, self-driving and so on, is kind of so obviously impactful to day-to-day life. And it feels more physical. In any case, even the AI feels somehow more physical than cryptocurrency. So I do think it takes away the attention and the capital. And so I kind of agree with you. The thing is, of course, they're not mutually exclusive, right? So you can both have them rising, and it's just a question of like which one underperforms or outperforms. So yeah, I agree with you. I won't try to avoid my own question. So for me, thinking about 2026, the thing that I've seen a growing trend with is the intersection of like crypto trading platforms and then traditional trading platforms as well. And I think that's just going to kind of come through even more. And it's almost a synthesis of what you guys were saying, where, the crypto market has matured enough. You get the stable coin, you get the RWA. And so I think a lot of guys, just like the Schwabs or the Fidelity or the Vanguard, potentially, I mean, some of them already have, enabling crypto trading or interactive brokers. You're going to see a lot of them doing blockchain related stuff and cryptocurrency related stuff alongside prediction markets, which aren't necessarily just crypto. And then on the other end, you're going to see crypto firms. I'm thinking of like, let's say the Coinbase or the Binance and so on, and the Kraken going into maybe tokenized stocks, as Kraken, already has, and also prediction market. And so it all is going to converge into this melting pot, which I think is really positive for us as like crypto native, because it means that the value prop of a blockchain-based solution is kind of highlighted from both sides. The crypto native ones are going to be winning because now they're competing with bigger guys with more efficiency and on a bigger market. And then the big guys are also enabling crypto and so benefiting out of that. And then it becomes a race about who can implement it the best, the fastest, in the most impactful way. So I'm really curious about that. And so my little hopium, narrative is also that if that does happen, then altcoins, and so the other chains on which you can have smart contracts, actually gets bolstered, and that can probably be Ethereum, could also be Solana, could also be Hyper, could also be, whatever it is. That's kind of it.
I think so. One thing we've not touched on it, but I actually believe it's a big piece of news. Now, Grayscale has changed the ETH ETF to staking ETF. And I think that's sort of the next big thing in, like unlocking. So essentially that enables investors to participate in it being scaled. And by it, I mean, not just Ethereum, but I mean blockchain. And I ultimately agree. I think we're getting to a point also with AI, with the infrastructure that is required for AI, where we can actually power this decentralized economy, and it will probably be semi-decentralized, because I don't believe that there's going to be, so if you're talking about like pay runs or payroll, that's probably nothing that people would want to be completely visible, right? But ultimately that's going to be a key driver as well, and I think that we will see a lot more traditional businesses taking use of DeFi or DeFi adjacent applications as well. And I think from that perspective, it's super exciting. So we're in a really, really good spot, and the fundamentals are there. Strong economy. Typically, the S&P doesn't post, or it's less likely for the S&P after 3 consecutive years that closed higher to close at a 4th year. But then we've had runs that went on for a longer time, and on the oil side, which is why I highlighted, we're still looking quite constructive. So I don't have any concerns. There's still the sort of macroeconomic, the wild card that can essentially pop, but I don't know. I don't see anything negative, unless, I don't know. I'm not sure what the question would be for me as the last question, perhaps for you guys. What would be a thing that you wouldn't want to see, something that would ultimately push us into a bear market, like not just for altcoins but for Bitcoin as well?
I think for me, I have a strong answer, so I'll just jump in and say it is the DATs starting to sell their treasury. I think if that happens, then it will pose a very serious threat to the markets, because the amounts that everybody was like clapping hands and rejoicing about, those companies buying, if it starts going the other way, which I don't think it necessarily has, but it's something that I would hate to see, then it gives green light for all the other DATs to start selling and front running each other, and then you get those cascading liquidations for anybody that was leveraged long, and then it's just like that's like an FTX crash type of event. Not to say that we would go as low, but as in like relative to the all-time high, I think it would take us down. That's it.
I just think just a general unwinding of risk, and so maybe I don't know, Fed doesn't want to cut as much anymore. You see inflation creeping back up. AI starts to stagnate a bit. Maybe the model performances aren't as good as people were projecting. Some of the hyperscalers start to pull back on capex. The sort of the promise of the AI trade starts to come into question, and then I think you might see just sort of a bigger general slide to being risk off. But I think that's a lot of ifs and buts that need to happen. I think for inflation, there are arguments that it's still remaining sticky, even though it has been kind of coming down. All signs for the Fed seem like Trump's going to appoint a new Fed chair this year, who's going to be driving rates down. I guess as well, it's like then more a question of the US dollar strength and belief in that as a system. It kind of ties back to the debasement trade, where gold and precious metals have been pumping because a lot of other nations are sort of starting to get worried about US debt and money printing. So I think obviously that it'll probably, if it does go into a bear market, it's probably going to be none of these things and something no one was really expecting. But I think for me, it might just be a general shift in sentiment where, like you said as well, Thomas, it's like we've had a solid 3 years, and if growth doesn't sort of keep at the pace it's been going, people might be like, oh, maybe we do a little pullback and let's front run everyone and risk off before a pullback. But it has just felt very jittery though, ever since sort of, yeah, pretty much like Trump coming into power. I think everyone's been a bit sort of on a knife edge of, oh, it's really good, it's really bullish, but like it's all a bit too good to be true. So let's risk off at random points, and yeah, it's just felt very choppy. One thing I did want to touch on, just a slight shift to tracks for what Thomas was saying though about certain technologies when it comes to blockchain, which I think is an interesting point that I think does kind of cross the bridge between the sort of promise of AI and AI adoption and implementation and blockchain, where in a more sort of autonomous, automated, agentic future where you've got a lot of these AI systems transacting and talking with each other, I think there is an increasing sort of use case for blockchain technology when it comes to being this sort of medium of exchange and medium of validation, and sort of an instant verifiable digital sort of like mechanism, for example, which the traditional rails are not as equipped to sort of use, especially at the rate these AI models might want to be sort of conversing and transacting with each other. And so I think there might be a whole other sort of subset of crypto that does very well with increasing AI adoption, which is things that are maybe more focused on sort of agentic models and AI. So again, filling my own bags as always, but I think Tau is a potential example of that, where they're trying to create sort of more of like a subnet for for sort of agent payments and interactions and things like that. And so do I think they'll be the one to ultimately win? Probably not, but it's enough of a narrative that I could see sort of people wanting to take a punt on. So I think I'll also be kind of keeping a lookout for any sort of AI utility crypto plays as well.
Yeah, no, it's a 4-2X as well, so it's definitely an interesting one, and I'm pretty sure that one thing I'm very, very keen on is that we are going to see a lot more adoption, and quite excited. So yeah, welcome 2026, everyone. It's an exciting year, and I can't wait to fast forward 12 months and to see where we're at. But yeah, it will be interesting, and it will be a good ride, as it always is. So I think that's guaranteed for sure.
Okay, I'll say
price prediction for Lighter, Justin.
30 US dollar. No, 26,
Wow.
26 US dollar.
Oh,
26
shit,
US dollar.
okay.
So, and there's a reason. I'll just talk for 30 seconds about it, but there's a reason why. When you look at the metrics, like even in terms of usage and liquidity and spreads and so on, I think it's relatively comparable to Hyperliquid. Of course, Lighter is like on a no-fee basis, and it's a different community, and it's a different maybe value prop, but it is EVM, which I think opens it up to a much broader ecosystem and maybe integration into other solutions, features, collateral, yield, staking, and all that stuff, and even just access for all the people that are already on EVM chains. So I think there's a value prop that is at least comparable to Hyperliquid, if not superior. And so what I did, of course, as any guy who buys into a new project, is you go to market cap of, that website where you can put the symbol of one and the symbol of the other, and you see what prices. The prices, if we get to the market cap of Hyperliquid right now, not the all-time high right now, it would be Lighter at 26.5 US dollar, which I think would be, right now we're trading at like $3. So you can see how many X's that would be.
Like an 8X, 9X.
And that's not assuming that crypto markets rally, as in Hyperliquid could go higher, Lighter could go higher, and so on. So I feel like my break-even point, because I TWAP'd over the 3 days of since launch, my TWAP is at $2.60, so $2.60. Now we're trading at $3 or $3.20. If we go to 30, I'll be very happy. If we go even halfway through, I'll still be very happy. If we go anywhere above $3, I'm still okay, basically. And then the only thing that's kind of keeping me staying in the back of my head is, of course, the opportunity cost, right? Which is, could I have bought something else and made more money? But I'm still pretty confident in my bag. That's it.
Nice.
So I sold my Aster. So Aster was okay. Sold that for Lighter, and I also consolidated. I had like a bunch of like small coins that I had no faith in. Small, like $500 US, 1K, 2K, something like that. All of that just went into Lighter, and that's it.
Nice.
But my pitch.
No, it's good. I'm sold. I'll probably have a nibble.
Yeah, I think it's not financial advice, but I think in a diversified portfolio it makes sense. Guys, I think we're way over time. We're having a call in any case in 2 weeks, as we always do. So I think maybe next time we can do a bit more of the degen stuff and price prediction and different coins. But I think this one was very geopolitical and broad, but I think it makes sense as the first call of 2026. So I really enjoyed it.
Let's hope for higher prices in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's do it.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.